Say it again, you'd quit for $5? The voice didn't rise, didn't shake, didn't beg. It landed low and steady, like something anchored deep beneath the surface, and for a brief second, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead felt louder than every person in the store. Then the laughter came. It spread fast, sharp and careless, bouncing off the glass coolers and polished tile like it belonged there, like it had always been waiting for a moment like this. The manager leaned back behind the counter, arms folded across his chest, a smirk curling slow and confident across his face. "You heard me," he said, his tone thick with amusement. "If you've got $5, I'll walk out that door right now." A couple of customers chuckled under their breath. One man near the coffee station shook his head, whispering just loud enough, "Man's got jokes." But the man standing in front of the counter didn't laugh. Marcus stood still, his coat worn thin at the edges, the fabric carrying the weight of too many winters, too many nights spent under skies that didn't care who you used to be. His hands rested at his sides, rough, steady, not reaching out, not asking for anything. The smell of stale coffee and cheap cleaner hung in the air, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes stayed on the manager, calm, focused, like he was measuring something no one else could see. "Sir," Marcus said quietly, choosing the word with care, not submission, not fear, just respect shaped by habit, "I'm not here for trouble. I just want to buy a loaf of bread." The manager let out a short laugh, louder this time, inviting the room in on the joke. "With what?" he shot back, glancing at the others like he expected applause. "You planning to pay with that story?" Another ripple of laughter. Someone near the door muttered, "That's how it always is." The words slipped out casual, but they hung heavy, loaded with something older than the moment, something Marcus had heard before in different voices, different places, always carrying the same quiet judgment. Marcus didn't turn toward them. He didn't defend himself. He didn't raise his voice. He just breathed in slowly, the kind of breath that settles a storm instead of feeding it. "I have money," he said, just as calm as before. That only made it worse. The manager leaned forward now, palms pressing lightly against the counter, eyes narrowing with mock curiosity. "Oh yeah? Then where is it?" he asked, his voice dropping into that tone people use when they've already decided the answer. A woman by the aisle crossed her arms, watching, not intervening, not looking away. A teenage boy near the snack rack pulled out his phone, like this was something worth capturing, something worth remembering for the wrong reasons. The room shifted, not in silence but in expectation. Everyone leaned just a little closer, waiting for the punchline they were sure was coming. Marcus reached slowly into the inside pocket of his coat. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, like he understood exactly what this moment was and refused to rush through it. The fabric rustled softly, the only sound that didn't belong to someone else's laughter. For a second the manager's smirk widened, convinced this was where it would fall apart. "Go on," he said, almost encouraging, like he was offering Marcus a chance to embarrass himself properly. But Marcus didn't look at him. His gaze dropped briefly, not in shame but in focus, as his fingers closed around something inside that pocket. The laughter softened, just a fraction, curiosity creeping in where certainty had been. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed to dip, like the room itself was holding its breath without realizing it. Marcus exhaled slowly, steady as ever, and began to pull his hand back into the light. Marcus's hand emerged from the worn lining of his coat, not trembling, not rushed, just steady, like the motion had been practiced 1,000 times in a life that no one in that room had bothered to imagine, and for a split second the object in his fingers did not register to anyone watching, because it did not fit the version of him they had already decided was true. It was a wallet, old but carefully kept, the leather cracked at the edges yet clean, like it had been protected even when everything else had not. And the laughter that had filled the store moments earlier thinned into scattered, uncertain chuckles as Marcus placed it gently on the counter, not sliding it, not tossing it, just setting it there with a quiet kind of respect that seemed out of place in a room that had offered him none. The manager raised an eyebrow, still smiling but slower now, the confidence in his posture shifting just enough to notice if someone was paying attention. "That is your big reveal?" he asked, voice lighter but not as sharp. And Marcus did not answer immediately. Instead he opened the wallet with careful fingers, revealing its contents layer by layer, not for show, not for drama, but because that was how he handled things that mattered. Inside were cards, worn but organized, a folded receipt, and tucked into the inner sleeve a photograph, the edge of it just visible, and Marcus's thumb paused there for a fraction of a second, pressing lightly against it as if grounding himself. Then he moved past it and pulled out a single bill, placing it flat on the counter. $5, clean, uncreased, undeniable. The room went quieter, not silent but different, like something had shifted that no one wanted to name yet. The teenage boy lowered his phone slightly, unsure now if this was still something to laugh at. The woman by the aisle uncrossed her arms just enough to lean forward, and the man near the coffee station stopped stirring his cup. Marcus looked up, meeting the manager's eyes again, calm as before. "That is $5, he said simply. No emphasis, no challenge, just a fact spoken clearly, and the manager stared at the bill for a second longer than expected, then let out a short breath through his nose, a forced laugh trying to reclaim control of the moment. "Anyone can have $5, he replied, waving a hand dismissively, but it did not land the same way this time, not with the same ease. Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing or arguing. Then he reached back into the wallet, and this time the movement drew every eye in the room, slower now, heavier with expectation. He pulled out a card, matte black, its surface catching the overhead light in a way that made it impossible to ignore. He did not flash it, did not angle it for effect. He simply placed it next to the bill, side by side, quiet and deliberate. The cashier behind the register blinked, leaning in closer. The manager's smirk faltered just a fraction, his eyes narrowing not in mockery now but in recognition he did not want to admit. "What is that supposed to mean?" he asked, and Marcus finally allowed a small shift in his expression, not a smile, not pride, just something steady and grounded. "It means," Marcus said, his voice still even, "I am not what you assumed." The words did not rise, did not accuse, they simply existed, and somehow that made them heavier. The room held on to that sentence, turning it over in silence. The manager straightened slightly, crossing his arms again but tighter this time, as if trying to rebuild the posture he had before. "You think a card changes anything?" he said, but there was a crack in the delivery now. Subtle but real. Marcus shook his head gently. "No, sir," he replied. "It does not change anything about me." He paused, letting that settle. "It just reveals what you chose not to see." The air in the store felt different now, thicker, not with tension alone but with awareness, the kind that arrives late and does not leave easily. The teenage boy slipped his phone back into his pocket. The woman by the aisle looked down briefly, then back up, her expression softer, uncertain, and the man at the coffee station cleared his throat quietly, as if realizing he had been part of something he did not fully understand. Marcus closed the wallet halfway, not in a hurry, his fingers brushing again against the photograph inside, and this time he pulled it out, placing it beside the card. It was a picture of an older woman, smiling gently, her hand resting over his, both of them seated close together. The background faded but warm. Marcus's gaze dropped to it for a moment, something shifting behind his eyes, not sadness, not regret, just memory. "My mother used to say," he began, his voice softer now but no less steady, "a man is not measured by what he carries in his pocket, but by how he carries himself when no one is looking." He looked back up, meeting the manager's eyes again. "I believed her then." A small pause. "I still do." No one laughed this time, no one spoke. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, the refrigerators buzzed quietly, but the room itself felt still, like it had been forced to stop and listen to something it had ignored for too long. And Marcus, standing there in a coat worn by weather and time, did not look smaller under their gaze. If anything, he looked exactly as he had all along, only now they were finally seeing it. The silence did not break all at once, it shifted, uneven and uncomfortable, like the room itself was trying to decide what to do with the truth now sitting on the counter in plain sight. The manager's fingers tapped lightly against the surface, not in rhythm, not in control, just something to do with the energy that no longer belonged to him. His eyes moved from the $5 bill to the black card, then to the photograph, and finally back to Marcus, searching for something familiar to hold onto, something that would put everything back into place. "You think this changes how this works?" he said, his voice lower now, measured, but the edge had dulled. Marcus did not move, did not reach for the items, did not rush to explain himself. He simply stood there, shoulders relaxed, presence steady, like he had already said everything that needed to be said. "No, sir," Marcus replied, his tone calm, respectful, but firm in a way that did not invite interruption. "It does not change how This works. He let that settle for a moment, the words echoing softly against the walls that had heard too many quick judgments and not enough truth. It just shows how quickly people decide who deserves respect. The sentence did not accuse, it revealed, and that made it harder to push away. The cashier behind the register swallowed quietly, glancing at the manager as if waiting for direction, but none came, not right away. The man by the coffee station shifted his weight, looking down into his cup like it held an answer. The teenage boy avoided eye contact completely now, his earlier curiosity replaced by something closer to discomfort. Marcus reached forward then, not hurried, not hesitant, and turned the photograph slightly so it faced the manager more clearly. The woman in the image smiled with a softness that carried history, her hand resting gently over Marcus's, both of them seated side by side on what looked like an old porch, sunlight falling across their shoulders. She believed in showing people who you are before telling them, Marcus said quietly, his gaze resting on the image for a brief second, then lifting again. Not everyone listens. The manager exhaled through his nose. Slower this time, his posture loosening in ways he did not seem to notice. The certainty he had started with was gone, replaced by something less comfortable, something that asked questions he did not want to answer. Look, he began, rubbing the back of his neck briefly. You came in here looking like... He stopped, the sentence unfinished, hanging in the air like something he realized should not be said out loud. Marcus did not react to the pause, did not fill it in for him. He simply waited. And that patience carried more weight than any interruption could have. The manager tried again. You have to understand, people see what they see, he said, his tone shifting toward explanation, almost justification, and Marcus nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing with it. That is true, he said. But what people choose to do with what they see, that is where it matters. The words were steady, not raised, but they landed with clarity, the kind that does not fade quickly. The woman by the aisle stepped forward slightly now, her voice softer than before. You said you just wanted bread, she said, not to challenge but to understand. Marcus turned his head toward her, meeting her eyes briefly. Yes, ma'am, he replied, the word respectful, clear, grounded. Just bread. She nodded slowly, something shifting in her expression, something quieter, more thoughtful. The manager looked between them, then back at the counter, at the $5 bill that had started as a joke and now sat there as something else entirely. He reached out, hesitated, then picked it up, holding it between his fingers as if weighing more than its value. The fluorescent lights reflected faintly off its surface, and for a moment, he seemed unsure whether to hand it back or keep it, unsure of what the right action even was anymore. Marcus watched him, not impatient, not expectant, just present, and that presence filled the space in a way no one else in the room could match. You said you would quit, Marcus said quietly, not as a challenge, not as a demand, just as a reminder of words spoken too easily. The manager's eyes flickered up, meeting Marcus's again, and for the first time since this began, there was no humor in them, no performance, just a man standing in the middle of a moment he had created and could not control. I said a lot of things, he replied, the sentence coming out slower than intended. Marcus gave a small nod, accepting that answer for what it was, not pushing further, not needing to. The room remained still, every person inside it aware now that something had changed, not just in the situation but in themselves, in the way they had reacted, in the way they had seen someone standing right in front of them. Marcus gently closed the wallet, placing the photograph back inside with care, then looked back at the manager one more time, his voice calm, steady, unchanged from the beginning. I am still here for the same reason, he said, to buy bread. And in that moment, stripped of assumptions, stripped of noise, the request sounded exactly as simple as it had always been, only now it carried the weight of everything that had been revealed. Along the way, the manager's grip tightened slightly around the $5 bill, not enough to crease it, but enough to show the hesitation that had not existed a few minutes ago. His eyes dropped to the register, then to the shelves behind Marcus where rows of bread sat untouched, simple, ordinary, the kind of item no one ever questioned until this moment made it feel like something more. Just bread, he repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of those words in his own mouth. The confidence that once filled his voice replaced by something slower, something uncertain. Marcus did not respond right away. He simply gave a small nod, confirming what had already been clear from the beginning, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, and that steadiness seemed to press against the room, forcing everyone to stay in the moment instead of escaping it. The cashier shifted behind the counter, glancing between the manager and Marcus, waiting for instruction that did not come quickly enough. "Ring it up," the manager finally said, but the words came out softer than expected, almost reluctant, like he was stepping into something he could not fully control anymore. The cashier reached for a loaf of bread, scanning it with a quiet beep that sounded louder than it should have. The price appeared on the screen, small, ordinary, yet somehow it carried more weight than the entire exchange that had come before it. Marcus reached forward and placed the $5 bill closer to the register, his movement calm, unhurried, as if nothing about this transaction was unusual to him, even though everyone else in the room felt the shift. The manager watched the motion closely, his eyes no longer dismissive, no longer distant but searching, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the assumptions he had made. "You could have said something earlier," the manager muttered, not quite looking at Marcus, more like speaking to the space between them. Marcus tilted his head slightly, considering the statement, then answered with quiet clarity. "I did," he said, his tone even. "I told you I had money." The simplicity of that response settled into the room with more force than any argument could have. The manager exhaled slowly, rubbing his thumb against the edge of the bill. "That is not what I meant," he said, but he did not elaborate, and Marcus did not ask him to. The silence stretched again, not uncomfortable this time but reflective, like something inside the manager was shifting in real time. Piece by piece, the cashier handed over the receipt, placing the change on the counter with careful precision. Coins clinking softly as they landed, Marcus picked them up without counting, trusting the transaction without question, a quiet contrast to the doubt that had been placed on him moments earlier. The woman by the aisle stepped closer now, her voice gentle, almost hesitant. "Sir," she said, addressing Marcus directly, the respect in her tone unmistakable. "I am sorry for how that started." Marcus turned toward her, meeting her gaze with calm acknowledgement. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied, the words simple, sincere, carrying no trace of resentment, and that lack of bitterness seemed to affect her more than anything else. She nodded, stepping back slightly, her expression thoughtful. The teenage boy looked down at his shoes, shifting his weight, no longer interested in recording, no longer comfortable being a spectator. The man at the coffee station finally set his cup down, clearing his throat softly as if trying to reset himself. Marcus picked up the loaf of bread, holding it lightly in one hand, the plastic crinkling faintly under his fingers. Then he paused, not moving toward the door just yet. His eyes returned to the manager, not with accusation, not with triumph, but with something quieter, something more grounded. "You said you would quit," Marcus said again, his voice calm, steady, not pressing, just reminding. The manager looked up, meeting his gaze, and this time there was no attempt to deflect, no humor to hide behind, just a long pause where the weight of his own words settled in fully. He glanced around the store briefly, noticing the eyes on him, the silence that had replaced laughter, and for the first time, he seemed aware of how he had been seen, not as someone in control, but as someone who had made a mistake in front of witnesses. He swallowed lightly, then let out a slow breath. "I was not serious," he said, the admission quiet, stripped of its earlier confidence. Marcus nodded once, accepting the truth of that statement without pushing further. "I understand," he replied, and there was no sarcasm, no edge, just understanding offered freely. The manager's shoulders dropped slightly, tension leaving in a way he did not seem to expect. The moment lingered, not resolved in the way people might have anticipated, but settled in something more real, something less dramatic and more lasting. Marcus turned then, taking a step toward the door, the bell above it faintly visible against the glass, but before he reached it he stopped again, his voice carrying back without raising. "It costs nothing to treat someone with respect," he said, not turning around, not needing to. "But it can cost everything when you do not." The words hung in the air, not loud, not forceful but undeniable, the kind that stay long after the moment passes, and as Marcus pushed the door open, the soft chime of the bell broke the stillness, the cool air from outside slipping in, brushing past everyone in the room like a quiet reminder of something simple that had just become impossible to ignore. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft chime that lingered longer than it should have, the sound stretching into the quiet like an echo that refused to fade. And for a moment no one moved, no one spoke, as if the air itself needed time to settle around what had just happened. The manager remained behind the counter, his hand still resting where the $5 bill had been, his fingers now empty, the absence of it more noticeable than its presence had ever been. He looked toward the glass door where Marcus had just exited, watching the figure move across the parking lot under the dull gray sky. The loaf of bread tucked under his arm, steady, unhurried, unchanged, and something about that steadiness pressed against him in a way he could not shake. The cashier cleared her throat quietly, breaking the silence just enough to remind the room it was still a place of business, still a space where time was supposed to move forward. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, her voice directed at no one in particular, but it hung there unanswered. The woman by the aisle exhaled softly, shaking her head once as if releasing something she had been holding. Then she turned and walked toward the door, pausing briefly before stepping outside. Her eyes scanning the lot as if searching for Marcus, though she did not call out to him. The teenage boy adjusted his jacket, avoiding everyone's gaze, slipping out quietly without another word. The man at the coffee station took a slow sip, then set the cup down with more care than before, like he was aware of every small action now, aware of how quickly moments could change. The manager finally moved, stepping away from the counter, his posture no longer rigid, his shoulders lower, his expression distant, not from indifference but from thought. He reached for the register, pressing a button that did not need to be pressed, just something to occupy his hands, something to ground him in routine, but even that felt different now, like the familiar motions had lost their certainty. He glanced at the cashier, then away again, as if unsure how to speak in a room that had just seen him stripped of the authority he had relied on. "Get back to work," he said, but the words lacked force. They did not carry the weight they once did. The cashier nodded, though her eyes lingered on him a moment longer than usual, not in defiance, not in fear, but in quiet observation, the kind that sees more than it says. Outside, Marcus walked along the edge of the parking lot, the wind brushing lightly against his coat, the sky hanging low and heavy above him, but he did not look up. His focus stayed forward, each step measured, each movement calm. The bread in his hand a simple weight, something real, something earned without compromise. He reached the sidewalk and paused briefly, adjusting the collar of his coat against the chill, his fingers brushing against the inside pocket where the photograph rested, and for a moment, he pressed his hand there, not to check if it was still present, but as a quiet gesture, a connection that grounded him beyond the moment he had just left behind. Back inside, the manager walked toward the front of the store, stopping a few feet from the door, his reflection staring back at him through the glass, distorted slightly by the light and movement outside. He studied it, not out of vanity, but out of something closer to recognition, or perhaps the lack of it. He could have walked in here and said nothing. The man from the coffee station spoke up suddenly, his voice calm, thoughtful, not accusatory, just honest. The manager did not turn right away, his eyes still on the reflection. "He did not need to prove anything," the man continued, "but he did anyway." The words settled into the space between them, not loud, not forceful but steady. The manager finally looked over, meeting the man's gaze, and for once, he did not respond immediately. He let the statement sit, let it take shape in his mind. "People do not usually do that," the manager said after a moment, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge. The man nodded once. "That is because most people are tired of being judged before they are heard," he replied, then picked up his cup and walked toward the exit, leaving the manager alone with a thought. Outside, Marcus continued down the sidewalk, passing a row of parked cars, the faint sound of traffic in the distance blending with the steady rhythm of his steps. He did not look back at the store, not once, not out of pride, not out of indifference, but because there was nothing left behind that he needed to carry forward. His path remained in front of him, simple, quiet, and certain. Inside, the manager remained where he stood, the reflection in the glass now empty of Marcus, replaced only by his own image, and for the first time that day, it did not feel like enough. The fluorescent lights hummed softly above him, the store returning slowly to its usual rhythm, but something had changed beneath it. Something that would not be reset with a shift change or a closing time. Something that would stay, quiet but persistent, in the space between what had been said and what had been understood. The afternoon light stretched long across the sidewalk, turning the concrete into a pale ribbon that seemed to carry Marcus forward without resistance. And for the first time since he stepped out of the store, the world around him felt quieter than the thoughts moving inside his chest. Not heavy, not chaotic, just present, like a slow current that did not need to rush to reach its destination. He walked past a small bus stop bench where an older man sat hunched over, adjusting the sleeve of his coat, and Marcus slowed slightly, not out of obligation but out of instinct, the kind that had never left him even when everything else had shifted. "You all right, sir?" Marcus asked gently, his voice low, respectful. The older man looked up, surprised, blinking once before nodding. "Just cold," he replied, his tone matter-of-fact. Marcus glanced down at the loaf of bread in his hand, then back at the man, considering something silently. Then he stepped closer and sat on the edge of the bench, placing the bread between them, not offering it outright, not making a gesture that would turn kindness into spectacle, just placing it there like a shared option. "It is fresh," Marcus said simply. The older man looked at the bread, then at Marcus, something softening in his expression. "You sure?" he asked. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir," he answered, no hesitation, no explanation needed. The man gave a small smile, quiet but genuine, and broke off a piece, the plastic wrapping rustling faintly as the sound blended into the stillness around them. And for a moment there was no past, no judgment, no assumptions, just two men sitting side by side, sharing something simple in a world that often complicated everything. Across the street, a car slowed at the light, the driver glancing briefly in their direction before continuing on, unaware of the quiet exchange that held more meaning than anything loud or visible. Marcus leaned back slightly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze forward, not fixed on anything specific, just open, and the older man spoke again after a few moments. "Not many people stop like that anymore," he said, his voice carrying a note of quiet observation rather than complaint. Marcus nodded slightly. "People are busy," he replied, then paused, choosing his next words with care. "Sometimes too busy to see what is right in front of them." The older man let out a soft breath, almost a laugh, though it carried more understanding than humor. "That sounds like experience talking," he said. Marcus's expression did not change much, but there was a flicker in his eyes, something that acknowledged the truth without needing to expand on it. "It is," he answered simply. The wind moved again, brushing lightly against their coats, carrying with it the faint scent of the city, distant traffic, and something else harder to name. Something like time passing without asking permission. Back at the store, the manager remained near the front, his reflection still faint in the glass, but now he was not looking at it. His gaze had shifted outward, watching the sidewalk where Marcus had disappeared moments earlier, his mind replaying fragments of the interaction, not in full sentences but in moments, the calm tone, the steady eyes, the simple request, and the way everything had shifted without force. He rubbed his hand over his face briefly, then dropped it, the gesture small but revealing. "You okay?" the cashier asked from behind the counter, her voice careful, not intrusive, just present. The manager did not answer right away. He exhaled slowly, then nodded once, though the motion felt incomplete. "Yeah," he said, but the word did not carry conviction, it just filled space. The cashier watched him for a second longer, then returned to her tasks, though her movements were slower now, more deliberate, as if the moment had reached her too outside. Marcus stood up from the bench after a while, the remaining bread still resting beside the older man, who gave him a small nod of gratitude that did not need words. Marcus returned it with the same quiet acknowledgement, then stepped back onto the sidewalk, continuing his path, the rhythm of his steps steady, unchanged, but something in the air around him felt lighter, not because the world had changed, but because he had not let it change him. His hand brushed lightly against the inside of his coat again, feeling the presence of the photograph, the memory, the voice that had shaped him long before this day. And as he walked forward, the fading light stretched ahead, not as a shadow, but as a path, quiet, certain, and his own. The city lights began to flicker on one by one as Marcus moved farther down the street, each step carrying him away from the store but not from the moment that had quietly reshaped something unseen. The air cooled slightly, brushing against his face with a softness that felt almost intentional, like the world had shifted its tone without asking permission. And across the street, a sleek black sedan rolled slowly to a stop near the curb, its engine humming low, almost silent beneath the distant sound of traffic. Marcus did not notice it at first, his attention forward, steady, grounded in the rhythm of his own pace. But the car door opened with a muted click that broke through the evening air, and a man stepped out, dressed in a tailored coat that caught the light just enough to reveal its precision, his posture upright, his expression composed but intent. "Mr. Marcus," the man called out, his voice calm, controlled, carrying across the space without needing to rise. Marcus slowed, then stopped, turning slightly, his eyes narrowing just a fraction, not in suspicion, but in recognition that something unexpected had entered his path. "Yes," he replied, His tone measured, respectful. The man approached, each step deliberate, stopping a few feet away, maintaining distance not out of caution but out of respect. "My name is Daniel Reeves," he said, extending a hand, not too close, not too far. Marcus looked at it briefly, then met the man's eyes before shaking it, his grip firm, steady. "I saw what happened back there," Daniel continued, nodding subtly toward the direction of the store. Marcus released the handshake and let his hand fall naturally back to his side, his expression unchanged. "A lot of people saw," Marcus said quietly. Daniel gave a small nod, acknowledging the truth in that. "Most people saw the surface," he replied. "I saw something else." Marcus tilted his head slightly, not dismissive, just listening. "And what is that, sir?" he asked. Daniel's gaze held steady, not analyzing, not judging, just clear. "Control," he said. "Not over the situation but over yourself." The word lingered between them, simple, precise. Marcus did not respond immediately. His eyes shifted briefly to the side, toward the passing cars, then back again. "That is something my mother taught me," he said after a moment, his voice softer now, but no less certain. Daniel nodded once, as if that answer confirmed more than it explained. "That kind of discipline," Daniel continued, "it is not common." Marcus gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, not from pride but from understanding. "It is not easy," he replied. Daniel glanced at the loaf of bread still in Marcus's hand, then back at him. "You bought that with $5, he said, not as a question but as a statement. Marcus nodded once. "Yes, sir." Daniel paused, considering his next words carefully, then spoke with quiet intention. "I would like to offer you something." Marcus did not react outwardly, his posture remained steady but his attention sharpened. "Go on," he said. Daniel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card, not flashy, not oversized, just simple, clean, and held it out between them. "I run a small operations firm," he said. "Logistics, maintenance, asset recovery, the kind of work that requires people who do not panic under pressure." Marcus looked at the card but did not take it yet, his gaze lifted back to Daniel's face. "And you believe I fit that description?" he asked. Daniel's answer came without hesitation. "I believe you showed more composure in 5 minutes than most people do in 5 years. The statement was not exaggerated, not dramatic, just direct. Marcus finally reached out and took the card, his fingers brushing lightly against its surface, feeling its weight, its presence, something different from everything else he had carried that day. "I am not asking for charity," Marcus said, his voice steady, clear. Daniel shook his head immediately. "I would not offer it if it was," he replied. "I am offering opportunity." The word settled differently, not heavy, not forced, just open. Marcus looked down at the card again, then back up, his eyes thoughtful now, not uncertain but considering. "Why me?" he asked, not out of doubt but out of clarity. Daniel met his gaze, unwavering. "Because you did not let them define you," he said. "And because you did not need them to." The simplicity of that answer carried more weight than any detailed explanation could have. The streetlight above them flickered once, then steadied, casting a soft glow over the moment. Marcus exhaled slowly, the breath measured, controlled, then gave a small nod, not acceptance yet, but acknowledgement. "I will think about it," he said. Daniel smiled faintly, not pushing, not expecting more. "That is all I ask," he replied, stepping back slightly, giving Marcus space. "The number is on the card," he added. "Whenever you are ready." Marcus slipped the card into his coat pocket beside the photograph, the two resting together, past and possibility side by side. And as Daniel returned to his car, the engine humming softly once more, Marcus stood still for a moment, the city moving around him, unchanged, yet somehow different, and then he turned, continuing forward, the path ahead no longer just a continuation, but something quietly opening step by step. The night settled deeper as Marcus continued down the street, the hum of the city softening into a distant rhythm that no longer demanded his attention, and the card in his pocket felt different from anything else he carried, not heavy, not urgent, just present, like a quiet possibility waiting without pressure. He walked past a row of dim storefronts, their windows reflecting fragments of his movement, pieces of a man who had been seen one way only hours ago and now stood in a space that no longer belonged to that version. He paused briefly under a streetlight, the glow casting a warm circle around him, and for a moment he reached into his coat, pulling out the photograph first, his thumb brushing gently across its surface, the familiar lines, the softness of his mother's expression, the way her eyes had always carried both strength and patience at once. "You do not let the world tell you who you are," Her voice echoed in his memory, not loud, not distant, just steady like it had always been. Marcus exhaled slowly, then slipped the photograph back into place before pulling out the card Daniel had given him. He turned it over once, reading the name again, the number, the simplicity of it. No promises written, no guarantees, just an opening, and for a brief moment, he stood there between two timelines, one shaped by survival, the other offering something more, not easier but different. Across the street, headlights passed in a steady stream, illuminating the edges of the sidewalk in flashes of white and gold, and Marcus watched them for a second, not distracted, just aware. Then he placed the card back into his pocket beside the photograph, the two resting together like a conversation between past and future that did not need to be rushed. Back at the store, the manager had not moved far from the front entrance, though the evening shift had begun to fill the space with new customers, their voices low, their presence unaware of what had unfolded earlier. But for him, the moment had not passed. It lingered in the way his hands rested on the counter, in the way his eyes drifted toward the door more often than necessary. The cashier approached him quietly, her tone careful but direct. "You keep looking out there," she said, not accusing, just observing. The manager let out a slow breath, not denying it. "I am thinking," he replied, the words simple but carrying more weight than before. She nodded once, leaning lightly against the counter. "About what?" she asked, and for a moment he did not answer, not because he could not, but because the truth was still forming in a way he had not experienced before. Finally he spoke, his voice lower, more grounded. "About how easy it is to be wrong about someone." The cashier held his gaze, not interrupting, not filling the silence, just letting it exist. "And how hard it is to admit it," he added, almost to himself. She gave a small nod, understanding without needing to elaborate. "You could still do something about it," she said quietly, the suggestion not forceful, just present. The manager looked toward the door again, the reflection faint against the glass, but this time it was not just his own image he saw. It was the moment replaying. The words spoken too quickly, the assumptions made too easily, and something inside him shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to move him. He straightened slightly, his posture adjusting, not to reclaim authority, but to carry something different. "Maybe I will," he said, the words tentative but real. Outside, Marcus began walking again, leaving the circle of light behind him, his steps steady, his pace unchanged, but there was something in the way he moved now that carried quiet intention, not driven by what had happened but informed by it. He reached a corner where the sidewalk split, one path leading toward the shelter he had been staying at, the other toward a quieter part of the city where opportunity felt less immediate but more open. He paused for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but to acknowledge the choice. His hand brushed against his coat again, feeling both the photograph and the card, and without hesitation, he stepped forward, not looking back, not questioning the path, just moving with the same calm certainty that had carried him through every moment of the day. The city continued around him, unchanged in its noise, its movement, its indifference, but within that, Marcus walked with something different, something that could not be taken, something that did not need to be proven again. And as the night deepened, the distance between where he had been and where he was going grew quietly, steadily, one step at a time. The night had fully taken hold by the time Marcus reached the quieter side of the city, where the streetlights stood farther apart and the sounds of traffic softened into a distant murmur. And there, beneath a single lamp that cast a steady amber glow onto the pavement, he slowed his steps, not from exhaustion, not from doubt, but from something deeper, something that asked him to pause and feel the weight of the day as it settled into memory. He reached into his coat once more, his fingers moving with familiar certainty as they found the photograph, and when he pulled it out, the light caught it just right, illuminating the gentle lines of his mother's face, the quiet strength in her eyes, and he held it there for a moment, longer than before, not searching for answers but acknowledging the presence that had never left him. "You did not raise me to bend," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper but clear, steady, as if he were speaking directly to her across time. The wind moved gently through the street, brushing past him like a quiet response, and Marcus allowed himself a small breath, one that carried not relief but recognition. Then he slipped the photograph back into place and reached for the card again, turning it between his fingers, the edges smooth, the weight unfamiliar yet not unwelcome, and for the first time, he did not just see it as an opportunity, he saw it as a continuation, not of who he had been, but of who he had always chosen to be, a man who did not break under pressure, A man who did not let the world define his worth. Across town, the convenience store stood under its harsh white lights, the same as it always had, but inside, something had shifted in a way no one could fully name. The manager stood behind the counter once more, but his posture had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would catch attention from someone walking in for a quick purchase, but in a way that altered how he carried himself, how he looked at the people entering the store. A man in a worn jacket stepped up to the counter, his voice low, uncertain. "Do you have any day-old bread?" he asked, and for a brief moment the manager's mind flickered back to earlier, to the words he had spoken too quickly, the assumptions he had made without thought, and instead of reacting, instead of defaulting to the version of himself that had stood there before, he paused, just long enough to choose differently. "Yes, sir," he said, his tone respectful, measured, and he turned to retrieve it without hesitation. The cashier noticed, her eyes lifting slightly, not surprised but aware, and she said nothing, because sometimes the most important changes are the ones that do not need to be announced. Outside, Marcus slipped the card back into his coat, placing it beside the photograph once more, the two resting together in quiet balance, and he looked ahead, the path no longer uncertain, not because it had become easier, but because he had never needed it to be. His steps resumed, steady, grounded, each one carrying him forward without hesitation, and as he moved beyond the reach of the streetlight, his figure blending into the deeper shadows of the city, there was no dramatic moment, no sudden transformation, just a man walking with quiet certainty, carrying nothing more and nothing less than who he was, and somewhere behind him, in a brightly lit store that would open again tomorrow, the echo of a single moment remained, not loud, not visible but lasting, because sometimes the strongest kind of change does not come from power, or from wealth, or from being proven right in front of others. It comes from the simple, unshakable choice to remain kind when the world expects you not to, and in that silence, in that steady, unwavering presence, there is a kind of strength that no one can take away, and no one can ever truly ignore.